The military base in Fort Braxton buzzed with unusual energy that crisp October morning. General Marcus Thornfield, a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning, strode across the training grounds with his characteristic swagger. His chest bore dozens of medals, each one telling a story of battles won and enemies defeated. At 52, he stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, his broad shoulders filling out his perfectly pressed uniform. His steel-gray eyes had seen combat in 3 different countries, and his hands had never known defeat in any physical confrontation. The general had built his career on 2 pillars: military excellence and an unshakable belief in his own superiority. He was known throughout the armed forces not just for his strategic brilliance, but for his intimidating presence. Soldiers would straighten their backs when he passed, and even fellow officers spoke to him with careful deference. His voice could silence a room of 100 men, and his glare could make seasoned veterans feel like fresh recruits. On this particular morning, General Thornfield was making his routine inspection of the base's new training facility. The Pentagon had invested millions in creating a state-of-the-art combat training center, complete with advanced simulation equipment and specialized sparring areas. As the commanding officer overseeing the facility's implementation, Thornfield took personal pride in every aspect of its operation. The training center attracted visitors from various military branches, and today was no exception. A group of international military observers had arrived to assess the facility's effectiveness. Among them was Colonel Sarah Chun from the Army Corps of Engineers, Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez from the Navy's Special Operations Division, and several other high-ranking officials. But what caught everyone's attention was an unusual addition to the group. Standing quietly near the entrance was a woman who seemed completely out of place among the uniformed officers. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with shoulder-length black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore civilian clothes, dark jeans, a plain white t-shirt, and comfortable sneakers. Her build was lean but athletic, though nothing about her suggested military training. She carried herself with quiet confidence, but next to the imposing figures in uniform, she looked almost invisible. Her name was Elena Rodriguez, and she was there as a civilian consultant. The military had recently begun incorporating experts from various fields to help improve their training programs. Elena specialized in human movement and biomechanics, with advanced degrees in both physical therapy and sports science. She had worked with Olympic athletes, professional fighters, and rehabilitation patients. Her expertise in body mechanics and efficient movement had caught the attention of military planners looking to reduce training injuries and improve combat effectiveness. However, Elena's presence at the facility that morning was not entirely welcome. General Thornfield had made his feelings about civilian consultants quite clear in previous meetings. He believed that military training should be designed by military personnel, not by academics who had never faced real combat. In his view, theoretical knowledge meant nothing compared to battlefield experience. As the tour group moved through the facility, Elena observed everything with keen professional interest. She watched as soldiers demonstrated various training exercises, taking mental notes about their movement patterns, body mechanics, and potential areas for improvement. Her trained eye could spot inefficiencies that others might miss: a slight favoring of one leg that could lead to injury, unnecessary tension in shoulders that reduced striking power, or improper weight distribution that left fighters vulnerable to takedowns. The group paused at the main sparring area, where several soldiers were engaged in hand-to-hand combat training. The large padded room was equipped with mirrors along one wall and various training equipment arranged around the perimeter. Heavy bags hung from reinforced ceiling mounts, and workout mats covered most of the floor space. The sound of fists hitting pads and feet sliding across mats filled the air. General Thornfield began explaining the training methodology to his guests, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades perfecting military combat techniques. He described the curriculum, the progression of skills, and the philosophy behind their approach. As he spoke, Elena noticed several technical issues with what she was observing, but she remained silent, knowing that unsolicited input would not be welcome. One young soldier, Private Martinez, was struggling with a particular grappling technique. His instructor was trying to show him how to escape from a rear chokehold, but Martinez kept making the same mistake repeatedly. Elena could see that the problem was in his hip positioning and the timing of his movement, issues that could be easily corrected with proper guidance. She watched as the private grew increasingly frustrated with his failures. "That boy will never make it in real combat," General Thornfield commented loudly, his voice carrying across the room. "Some people just don't have what it takes. All the training in the world can't fix weak genetics." Elena felt a surge of disagreement, but kept her expression neutral. She had worked with many athletes who initially struggled with techniques, but went on to achieve great success once they understood the proper mechanics. In her experience, very few people were truly unable to learn physical skills. They usually just needed the right instruction and approach. The demonstration continued with various combat scenarios. Soldiers showed techniques for disarming opponents, escaping from holds, and neutralizing threats. General Thornfield provided commentary throughout, often pointing out what he saw as weaknesses or areas needing improvement. His critiques were harsh and public, delivered in the kind of voice that brooked no disagreement. During a break in the demonstrations, Colonel Chun approached Elena to ask about her observations. "What do you think of the training protocols we've seen so far?" she asked quietly. Elena glanced around to make sure General Thornfield was not within earshot before responding. "There are some excellent elements," she said diplomatically. "The soldiers show good conditioning and fighting spirit. However, I do see some opportunities for improvement in terms of movement efficiency and injury prevention." Such as, Colonel Chin pressed, genuinely interested in the civilian expert's perspective. Elena pointed toward the sparring area where soldiers were still practicing. "For example, many of the fighters are generating power primarily from their upper body strength rather than using their entire kinetic chain. If they could learn to better engage their core and transfer energy from their legs through their torso, they would hit harder while using less energy and reducing wear on their joints." Before Colonel Chun could respond, General Thornfield's voice boomed across the room. "Miss Rodriguez," he called out, using a tone that suggested annoyance. "I couldn't help but notice you seem to have opinions about our training methods." Elena turned to face him, maintaining her composure despite the obvious challenge in his voice. "I was simply discussing some observations with Colonel Chun, sir." "Observations," the general repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. "And what exactly qualifies you to observe military combat training? Have you ever been in a real fight? Have you ever had to defend your life against someone trying to kill you?" The room fell silent. Other soldiers stopped their training to watch the confrontation unfold. Elena could feel dozens of eyes on her, but she remained calm. "No, sir, I haven't been in combat. My expertise is in biomechanics and human movement. I study how the body moves most efficiently and safely." General Thornfield let out a harsh laugh. "Biomechanics," he said mockingly. "That's just fancy talk for someone who reads books about fighting instead of actually fighting. Theory versus reality, Miss Rodriguez. In real combat, all your academic theories go out the window." Elena felt her cheeks flush, but kept her voice steady. "With respect, sir, biomechanics isn't theory. It's the science of how bodies actually move. Understanding proper mechanics can help fighters become more effective while reducing their risk of injury." "Is that so?" The general stepped closer, his imposing frame casting a shadow over her. "Tell me, in all your book learning, have you ever actually tested these theories? Have you ever put your biomechanics up against real fighting skill?" The challenge was unmistakable. Elena could sense the anticipation in the room as everyone waited for her response. She knew that backing down would undermine any credibility she might have with the military personnel present, but she also understood the risk of accepting such a challenge from a man with General Thornfield's reputation. "I have trained extensively in various martial arts," she replied carefully. "Not for combat, but to better understand movement patterns and body mechanics in action." "Martial arts," the general scoffed, "dancing around in pajamas following choreographed movements. That's not fighting. That's performance art." Elena felt a spike of anger, but forced herself to remain professional. She had encountered this attitude before. People who dismissed martial arts without understanding the science and skill involved. However, she had never faced such open hostility from someone in a position of authority. "Perhaps we should continue with the scheduled tour," Colonel Chun interjected diplomatically, sensing the tension escalating. "But General Thornfield wasn't finished. He was enjoying the audience and the opportunity to demonstrate his dominance over the civilian consultant who had dared to question his methods. No, I think this is educational. Miss Rodriguez here thinks she understands fighting better than people who have actually done it. Maybe she'd like to demonstrate these superior biomechanics she's been studying. The suggestion hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Elena realized she was being backed into a corner. Refusing would validate the general's dismissive attitude toward her expertise and potentially damage her professional credibility. Accepting could lead to injury or humiliation, given the general's size advantage and military training. I don't think that would be appropriate, she said finally. I'm here as a consultant, not a participant in training exercises. Of course not, General Thornfield replied with a knowing smile. All theory, no practice. That's exactly what I expected from another academic who thinks they can tell warriors how to fight. The condescension in his voice was thick enough to cut. Elena felt the eyes of every person in the room on her, weighing her response. She understood that this moment would define how she was perceived by everyone present, and potentially impact her ability to contribute to future military training improvements. In that tense silence, as General Thornfield stood confidently waiting for her to back down completely, Elena made a decision that would change everything. Her years of training, study, and practical application of movement science had taught her that size and intimidation were only two factors in any physical confrontation. Proper technique, timing, and understanding of leverage could overcome many apparent disadvantages. Actually, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart, if you think it would be educational, I'm willing to demonstrate some of the principles I was discussing. The general's eyebrows raised in surprise. He had expected her to retreat completely, not accept his implicit challenge. For a moment, he seemed taken aback by her response, but quickly recovered his composure. Excellent, he said with a predatory smile. Let's see what your books have taught you about real fighting. As the crowd gathered around to watch what promised to be either an embarrassing mismatch or an educational demonstration, neither Elena nor General Thornfield could have predicted how dramatically the next few minutes would unfold. The atmosphere in the training facility shifted dramatically as word spread through the room that General Thornfield and the civilian consultant were about to engage in some kind of demonstration. Soldiers abandoned their own exercises to gather around the main sparring area, forming a loose circle that provided clear viewing for what was about to unfold. The sudden silence was broken only by the quiet shuffling of feet as more personnel arrived to witness the unexpected confrontation. Elena removed her sneakers and placed them neatly at the edge of the mat. She rolled her shoulders once, loosening muscles that had tensed during the verbal confrontation, and began her mental preparation. This was not the first time she had faced skepticism about her expertise, though it was certainly the most public and potentially consequential. Throughout her career working with athletes and rehabilitation patients, she had learned that sometimes the best way to explain biomechanical principles was through practical demonstration. General Thornfield, meanwhile, was clearly relishing the situation. He removed his service jacket with deliberate care, folding it precisely and handing it to a nearby aide. Underneath, his white dress shirt stretched tight across his broad chest and thick arms. Even in his 50s, years of military training and discipline had kept him in excellent physical condition. His movements carried the confidence of someone who had never lost a physical confrontation, and his expression suggested he viewed this as little more than an opportunity to publicly embarrass someone who had challenged his authority. Before we begin, Colonel Chun interjected nervously. Perhaps we should establish some ground rules. This is just a demonstration, correct? Of course, General Thornfield replied without taking his eyes off Elena. I wouldn't want to seriously hurt our guest. We'll keep it simple, basic grappling, maybe some light sparring. Nothing dangerous. Elena nodded her agreement, though she could hear the patronizing tone in his voice. He was already assuming victory and considering how to make his domination look effortless while avoiding actual injury to her. She appreciated his restraint, even as she bristled at his presumption. The two opponents moved to the center of the mat, facing each other at a distance of about 6 feet. The size difference was immediately apparent to everyone watching. General Thornfield stood nearly a foot taller than Elena, and probably outweighed her by at least 80 pounds. His reach advantage was significant, and his military bearing made him appear even larger and more intimidating. "Ladies first," the general said with mock courtesy, gesturing for Elena to make the first move. Elena shook her head politely. "I'd prefer to see what you're working with first, if you don't mind." The general smiled, interpreting her response as hesitation or fear. "Very well. Let's start with something basic." He moved forward with the measured confidence of someone who had done this countless times before. His approach was straightforward and aggressive, the kind of direct attack that relied on size, strength, and intimidation to overwhelm an opponent quickly. He reached out with both hands, intending to grab her shoulders or arms, and use his superior leverage to control the engagement immediately. But, as his hands moved toward their targets, Elena was already in motion. Years of studying human movement had taught her to read body language and anticipate actions based on subtle physical cues. She could see the general's intentions in the way he shifted his weight, the angle of his shoulders, and the direction of his gaze. More importantly, she could see the small inefficiencies in his movement, the slight telegraphing of his intentions, the momentary commitment to a single line of attack that left him briefly vulnerable. Instead of trying to block or avoid his grasp directly, Elena stepped slightly to her left while simultaneously moving forward. The motion brought her inside his reach at an angle that made it difficult for him to adjust his grip effectively. At the same time, she used her hands to redirect his extending arms rather than oppose them directly, applying pressure that enhanced his forward momentum rather than stopping it. The general found himself suddenly off balance, his aggressive forward motion carrying him past his intended target. Elena's redirection had turned his strength against him, using his own force to disrupt his equilibrium. Before he could recover, she was behind his right shoulder, perfectly positioned to demonstrate one of the fundamental principles she had been discussing earlier. "You see," she said conversationally, as if they were still in the middle of a lecture rather than a physical confrontation, "efficient movement isn't about opposing force with greater force. It's about understanding angles and leverage." General Thornfield spun around quickly, his face showing the first signs of genuine surprise. The ease with which she had avoided his initial attack had been unexpected, but he attributed it to luck or his own momentary carelessness. He reset his stance and approached more cautiously this time, his military training kicking in as he began to take her more seriously. "Lucky break," he muttered, loud enough for the watching soldiers to hear. "Let's see you do that again." This time his approach was more measured. Instead of rushing forward, he circled slowly, looking for an opening and trying to use his reach advantage to control the distance between them. Elena matched his movement, maintaining her position relative to him while continuing to observe and analyze his technique. What she saw confirmed many of her earlier observations about the military training she had witnessed. The general was certainly skilled and experienced, but his technique relied heavily on physical advantages rather than mechanical efficiency. His movements generated power through muscle strength rather than kinetic energy transfer, and his defensive positioning prioritized intimidation over actual protection of vulnerable areas. When he attacked again, it was with a quick jab toward her face, a probing strike designed to test her reflexes and create an opening for a follow-up grappling attempt. Elena responded with a technique that looked deceptively simple but demonstrated sophisticated understanding of timing and distance. She moved her head just enough to let his punch pass by her ear, simultaneously stepping forward and to the side. Her counter-movement brought her into close range where his height and reach advantages became liabilities rather than assets. Before he could withdraw his extended arm, she had applied a gentle but precise pressure to his wrist and elbow that locked his entire arm in an uncomfortable position. The general tried to pull back, but found that any attempt to withdraw his arm increased the pressure on his joints exponentially. Elena's positioning and grip had created a mechanical disadvantage that made his superior strength irrelevant. The harder he pulled, the more uncomfortable the hold became. "This is an example of what I was talking about earlier," Elena explained to the watching crowd, her voice calm and educational despite the fact that she was currently controlling a man twice her size. "When you understand the body's natural leverage points and joint mechanics, you can control much larger opponents without relying on strength." General Thornfield's face was beginning to show signs of strain and frustration. The hold wasn't painful enough to cause damage, but it was definitely uncomfortable, and, more importantly, it was completely controlling his movement. He tried various approaches to break free, twisting, pulling, even attempting to use his free hand to grab her, but Elena smoothly adjusted her position and gripped to counter each attempt. After about 30 seconds of futile struggling, Elena released the hold and stepped back, allowing the general to recover. He rolled his shoulder and flexed his fingers, working out the stiffness from the joint manipulation. Interesting technique, he admitted grudgingly. But that's just one lucky grab. Combat isn't about single techniques, it's about sustained engagement. Elena nodded respectfully. You're absolutely right. Single techniques are just demonstrations of principles. Real application requires continuous adaptation and flow. The general's expression had changed noticeably from his earlier confidence. While he wasn't ready to admit defeat or error, he was clearly beginning to realize that his opponent possessed skills he hadn't anticipated. However, his competitive nature and public position made backing down impossible. If anything, his determination to prove his superiority had intensified. Let's try something more comprehensive then, he said. Free sparring, light contact, but continuous engagement until one of us achieves a clear dominant position. Elena considered the proposal carefully. Free sparring was significantly more dangerous than controlled demonstrations, especially against someone with the general's size and experience. However, she also recognized that anything less than a convincing demonstration would leave room for him to dismiss what had happened as luck or trickery. That seems reasonable, she agreed. Light contact, focused on control rather than damage. The two fighters reset their positions, this time taking more formal stances that indicated they were both taking the engagement seriously. The watching soldiers grew even quieter, sensing that they were about to witness something significant. General Thornfield began this phase with much more respect for his opponent's capabilities. His movements were cautious and controlled, and he avoided the kind of aggressive rushing that had gotten him into trouble earlier. Instead, he tried to use his reach advantage to maintain distance while looking for opportunities to close in safely. Elena, meanwhile, began to demonstrate the full scope of her movement expertise. She flowed between different ranges and angles with fluid precision, never staying in one position long enough for the general to target her effectively. Her footwork was economical and purposeful, each step serving multiple functions, creating angles of attack, maintaining optimal distance, and setting up defensive options. When the general attempted to grab her with a clinching technique, Elena used his own momentum to redirect him into an off-balance position. When he tried to strike, she was already moving to a location where his attack couldn't reach her effectively. Most impressively, she began to demonstrate combination techniques that linked defensive movements directly into counterattacks. The general found himself constantly reacting rather than initiating. Despite his experience and training, Elena's superior understanding of movement mechanics was allowing her to control the pace and direction of the engagement. Every technique he attempted was anticipated, redirected, or neutralized before it could achieve its intended effect. More troubling for the general was the fact that Elena was making her defensive techniques look effortless. While he was beginning to breathe more heavily from the exertion of constantly adjusting and reacting, she appeared to be moving with minimal effort. Her relaxed demeanor suggested that she was operating well within her capabilities, while he was beginning to feel the strain of trying to solve a puzzle that seemed to have no solution. The watching soldiers were beginning to murmur among themselves. What they were witnessing contradicted everything they had been taught about physical confrontation. Size, strength, and aggression were supposed to determine the outcome of fights, but those advantages seemed to be completely irrelevant against Elena's technique. As the engagement continued, General Thornfield's frustration became increasingly evident. His movements grew more aggressive and less controlled as he attempted to use his physical advantages to overwhelm Elena's technique. But each escalation on his part was met with increasingly sophisticated responses from her, demonstrating that she was capable of adapting to different levels of intensity without losing her technical precision. The moment that would define the entire encounter was rapidly approaching, though neither participant could have predicted exactly how it would unfold. The tension in the training facility had reached a breaking point. What had started as an academic discussion about training methods had evolved into something far more significant. The soldiers watching from the sidelines were witnessing their commanding officer being systematically outmaneuvered by someone they had initially dismissed as just another civilian consultant. The implications went beyond simple physical technique. Fundamental assumptions about combat effectiveness were being challenged before their eyes. General Thornfield's frustration was becoming increasingly evident. His usual commanding presence was being undermined by his inability to establish control over the engagement. Each technique he attempted was anticipated and neutralized, often in ways that left him more off balance than before. Elena's responses weren't just defensive. They were educational demonstrations that highlighted the inefficiencies in his approach while showcasing superior alternatives. The general wiped sweat from his forehead, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the watching soldiers. In all their years serving under him, they had never seen their commanding officer show signs of physical strain during any kind of training exercise. His reputation was built partly on his seemingly effortless dominance in any physical confrontation. Yet here he was clearly working harder than his much smaller opponent. "Getting tired, General?" Elena asked quietly, her tone professional rather than mocking. She wasn't trying to humiliate him, but rather hoping to help him understand the points she had been trying to make earlier about efficient movement and energy conservation. The question, however well-intentioned, struck General Thornfield like a slap. The suggestion that he might be tiring while fighting a civilian half his size was both accurate and infuriating. His military pride, combined with decades of believing in his own invincibility, made accepting such a reality impossible. "I'm just getting warmed up," he replied through gritted teeth, though his heavier breathing suggested otherwise. Elena nodded respectfully but continued her systematic demonstration of biomechanical principles. When he attempted a takedown, she used hip positioning and leverage to redirect his force while maintaining her balance. When he tried to use his reach advantage for striking, she closed distance at angles that made his attacks ineffective while creating opportunities for her own responses. What was most remarkable to the trained observers was not just Elena's defensive capabilities, but her restraint. It was becoming clear that she possessed the skills to end the engagement decisively at any time, yet she continued to focus on control and demonstration rather than domination. Her techniques were designed to neutralize and educate rather than damage or humiliate. Colonel Chun, watching from the edge of the mat, began to understand the true scope of what she was witnessing. Elena wasn't just demonstrating superior technique. She was providing a masterclass in applied biomechanics under pressure. Every movement illustrated principles that could revolutionize military hand-to-hand combat training if properly understood and implemented. The other military observers were having their own revelations. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez found himself mentally cataloging techniques that could be adapted for Navy SEAL training. The efficiency of movement and energy conservation Elena was demonstrating could provide significant advantages in extended combat situations where endurance was crucial. But General Thornfield was experiencing something entirely different. His worldview was being systematically dismantled by someone he had dismissed as an academic without practical experience. The cognitive dissonance between what he believed should be happening and what was actually occurring was creating a psychological pressure that was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. His movements began to lose their tactical discipline as emotion started to override training. The controlled aggression that had served him well in combat was being replaced by frustrated anger. His attacks became more predictable as he relied increasingly on brute force rather than technique. Elena recognized the change immediately. She had worked with enough competitive athletes to understand the psychological aspects of physical confrontation. When technical skill was neutralized by superior technique, many people resorted to increased aggression as a way of trying to regain control. However, this typically made them more vulnerable rather than more dangerous. "Sir," she said during a brief pause in the action, "might I suggest we conclude the demonstration? I think the principles have been clearly illustrated." The offer was both gracious and practical. Elena understood that continuing the engagement served no educational purpose and only increased the risk of the general doing something that might result in injury or further embarrassment. She was providing him with an opportunity to end the demonstration with his dignity relatively intact. But General Thornfield interpreted her offer as condescension. In his mind, she was suggesting that he couldn't continue, that he needed to be protected from further humiliation. The suggestion that he might need mercy from a civilian consultant was more insulting than any physical technique she had demonstrated. "We're not finished," he declared loudly, his voice carrying a harsh edge that made several watching soldiers exchange concerned glances. "I haven't shown you what real military combat training can accomplish." Elena sighed quietly, recognizing that the general's pride was going to force the situation to continue beyond the point of educational value. She prepared herself mentally for what was likely to be a more aggressive and potentially dangerous phase of the engagement. When the general attacked again, it was with a level of intensity that crossed the line from demonstration to genuine combat. His movements were faster and more committed, abandoning the restraint that had characterized the earlier phases. He was no longer trying to prove a point about training methodology. He was fighting to salvage his reputation and authority. Elena was forced to respond in kind. Her defensive techniques became more decisive, her counters more immediate and conclusive. The patient, educational demonstrations gave way to efficient neutralization of genuine threats. She was no longer teaching. She was protecting herself. The change in intensity was immediately apparent to everyone watching. This was no longer a friendly demonstration between colleagues, but something approaching actual combat. Several observers looked around nervously, wondering if they should intervene before someone was seriously hurt. General Thornfield launched into a combination attack that represented his most serious effort yet. He feinted with his left hand while stepping forward with a powerful right cross aimed at Elena's head, followed immediately by an attempt to use his momentum to drive her to the ground with a wrestling takedown. It was precisely the kind of aggressive, multi-phase attack that had served him well in previous confrontations. Against most opponents, the combination of striking and grappling would have been overwhelming, particularly given his size and strength advantages. But Elena had been reading his movement patterns throughout the engagement, and she recognized the attack sequence as it began to develop. Her response was a perfect demonstration of the biomechanical principles she had been discussing earlier, executed with a precision and timing that turned the general's strength completely against him. As his right hand extended toward her face, Elena stepped diagonally forward and to her left, moving inside his strike while simultaneously pivoting on her front foot. The movement brought her alongside his extended arm while positioning her at an angle that made his follow-up takedown attempt impossible. With her left hand, she guided his punching arm past its target while her right hand found a specific pressure point just below his elbow. The combination of his forward momentum and her precise redirection created a leverage situation that sent him stumbling past her, completely off balance. But the sequence wasn't finished. As the general tried to recover his footing and turned to face her again, Elena demonstrated why understanding kinetic energy transfer was so crucial to efficient fighting. Instead of using muscle strength to force him down, she simply added a small amount of precisely directed force to his existing motion. Her hands found contact points on his shoulder and hip that allowed her to guide his uncontrolled stumble into a more dramatic loss of balance. The general's own aggressive energy, redirected through proper leverage points, sent him tumbling toward the mat with significantly more force than Elena could have generated through strength alone. Time seemed to slow as General Thornfield realized what was happening. He was falling, completely out of control, victim of his own aggressive attack that had been turned against him through superior technique. The irony was not lost on him. His greatest strengths had become his greatest weaknesses against an opponent who understood how to use physics rather than force. Elena watched his descent with a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal concern. She had successfully demonstrated her principles under pressure, but she took no pleasure in the general's predicament. Her goal had always been education, not humiliation. General Thornfield hit the mat hard, his significant body weight combining with his redirected momentum to create an impact that resonated throughout the room. For a moment, he lay still, whether from physical shock or psychological overwhelm, no one could tell. The training facility fell completely silent except for the sound of Elena's controlled breathing and the general's heavier exhalations from the mat. The watching soldiers stood frozen, unsure how to process what they had just witnessed. Their commanding officer, The man they considered invincible had been decisively defeated by someone they had initially dismissed as irrelevant. Colonel Chun was the first to move, stepping forward to check on the general's condition while simultaneously looking to Elena for an explanation of what had just occurred. It's a basic application of leverage and momentum redirection, Elena explained quietly. His aggressive attack created the energy. I just guided it in a different direction than he intended. As General Thornfield slowly began to move, indicating that he was more stunned than injured, the full implications of what had happened began to settle over everyone present. This hadn't been luck or trickery. It had been a systematic demonstration of superior technique overcoming apparent physical advantages. The silence in the training facility stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. General Thornfield remained on the mat, propped up on his elbows, staring at Elena with an expression that cycled through disbelief, anger, and something that might have been dawning respect. His chest rose and fell heavily, not just from physical exertion but from the psychological impact of what had just occurred. Elena stood nearby, neither gloating nor apologetic, simply waiting to see how the situation would resolve itself. Her professional demeanor remained intact, though she was acutely aware that the next few moments would determine not only her future relationship with the military, but potentially the fate of her entire consulting contract. The watching soldiers remained frozen in place, their eyes moving between their fallen commander and the small woman who had somehow managed to defeat him. For many of them, witnessing this encounter was forcing a fundamental reevaluation of everything they thought they knew about combat effectiveness. The techniques Elena had demonstrated challenged core assumptions about how physical confrontations were supposed to unfold. Colonel Chun moved forward slowly, her medical training prompting her to check on the general's condition while her diplomatic instincts sought to find a way to defuse the tension that had filled the room. "General Thornfield, are you injured?" she asked with professional concern. The general slowly pushed himself to a sitting position, testing his joints and muscles for any sign of damage. Physically, he appeared to be fine. Elena's technique had been precisely controlled to neutralize rather than harm. Psychologically, however, he was clearly struggling to process what had happened. "I'm fine," he said quietly, though his tone lacked its usual commanding authority. He looked up at Elena, who had maintained her respectful distance while remaining alert for any sign that he might attempt to continue the engagement. He began, then stopped, apparently unsure how to complete the sentence. The words impossible, lucky, or a fluke all seemed inadequate to describe what he had experienced. For the first time in decades, General Thornfield found himself genuinely uncertain about something related to physical combat. Elena stepped forward and extended her hand to help him stand. The gesture was both practical and symbolic, an offer of assistance that acknowledged his humanity while demonstrating that she harbored no ill will despite his earlier dismissive treatment. After a moment's hesitation, the general accepted her help, allowing her to assist him to his feet. The simple act of accepting aid from the person who had just defeated him was itself a form of acknowledgement that his previous assessments had been incorrect. "How did you do that?" he asked once he was standing. The question was direct and professional, stripped of the condescension that had characterized his earlier interactions with her. Elena considered her response carefully. This was the moment she had been hoping for throughout the entire confrontation, an opportunity to actually discuss the principles she had been trying to explain before their demonstration had begun. "Everything I did was based on understanding how the human body moves and responds to force," she explained. "When you attacked, you committed your energy in a specific direction with specific timing. I didn't oppose that energy, I redirected it using leverage points and momentum transfer." She gestured toward the mat where they had been engaged. "For example, when you threw that final combination, your forward momentum carried most of your body weight onto your front foot. That made you extremely powerful in the direction you were moving, but also created a temporary instability in other directions." General Thornfield listened intently, his analytical military mind beginning to process the technical aspects of what she was describing. Despite his wounded pride, his professional curiosity was stronger than his personal embarrassment. "By stepping to the side and redirecting your punch rather than blocking it," Elena continued, "I was able to guide your momentum past your intended target. Once you were off balance, Adding just a small amount of force in the right direction was enough to take you down. But how did you know where to apply that force? Colonel Chen asked, her own professional interest evident. It seemed like you knew exactly what was going to happen before it occurred. Elena smiled slightly. That's the biomechanics part. The human body has predictable responses to certain types of pressure and leverage. When someone is moving aggressively forward, their balance becomes temporarily committed to that direction. If you understand the mechanical principles involved, you can predict how they'll react to specific types of interference. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez spoke up from the edge of the group. Are these techniques that could be taught to our personnel? Absolutely, Elena replied. In fact, that's exactly what I was hoping to discuss when I was brought in as a consultant. These principles can make fighters more effective while reducing their energy expenditure and injury risk. General Thornfield was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the implications of what he had experienced and learned. His entire career had been built on assumptions about combat effectiveness that Elena's demonstration had called into question. However, his dedication to military excellence ultimately outweighed his personal pride. Miss Rodriguez, he said formally, I owe you an apology. I dismissed your expertise without giving you a proper opportunity to demonstrate its value. Elena nodded graciously. Thank you, sir. I understand why you were skeptical. What I do probably looks very different from traditional military training. Different, yes, the general agreed, but clearly effective. He looked around at the watching soldiers, many of whom were still processing what they had witnessed. I think it would be valuable for our personnel to learn more about these techniques. Private Martinez, the young soldier who had been struggling with grappling techniques earlier, stepped forward hesitantly. Ma'am, he said to Elena, could you show us how to do what you just did? Elena looked to General Thornfield for permission. Despite what had happened, he was still the commanding officer, and any training modifications would need his approval. The general nodded slowly. I think that would be very educational for all of us. Over the next hour, Elena conducted an impromptu seminar on biomechanical principles applied to combat situations. She demonstrated how understanding leverage, timing, and energy transfer could make techniques more effective regardless of the practitioner's size or strength. The soldiers, initially skeptical, became increasingly engaged as they began to understand and successfully apply the concepts she was teaching. General Thornfield participated actively in the instruction, asking detailed questions and working through the techniques himself. His initial embarrassment at being defeated was gradually replaced by genuine enthusiasm for the potential applications of Elena's expertise. This could revolutionize how we approach hand-to-hand combat training, Colonel Chun observed as she watched soldiers successfully executing techniques that had previously been beyond their capabilities. It could revolutionize more than that, General Thornfield replied thoughtfully. Understanding these principles could improve everything from basic physical training to injury prevention to combat effectiveness. As the impromptu training session continued, word spread throughout the base about what had happened in the training facility. Soon, additional personnel were arriving to observe and participate in Elena's instruction. The initial confrontation had evolved into exactly the kind of collaborative learning experience that Elena had hoped to facilitate from the beginning. Private Martinez, who had been struggling earlier, was now successfully executing the grappling escape that had eluded him before. The difference was not in his physical capability, but in his understanding of the mechanical principles that made the technique effective. I can't believe how much easier this is when you understand why it works, he said to Elena during a break in the training. That's exactly the point, she replied. When you understand the science behind the technique, you can adapt it to different situations and opponents. You're not just memorizing movements. You're learning principles that can be applied creatively. General Thornfield overheard the exchange and approached them. Miss Rodriguez, he said, I'd like to discuss the possibility of expanding your role here. What you've shown us today has implications beyond basic training. Elena looked surprised. I hadn't expected such a positive response, especially after our earlier discussion. The general smiled ruefully. That earlier discussion was a learning experience for me as well. I learned that my assumptions about combat effectiveness were incomplete, and that there's value in perspectives that come from outside traditional military training. I learned something too, Elena admitted. I learned that theoretical knowledge needs to be tested under pressure to be truly validated. What happened today helped me understand how these principles perform in real-world applications. Colonel Chun joined the conversation. What kind of expanded role were you thinking about, General? I'd like Miss Rodriguez to help us redesign our entire hand-to-hand combat curriculum, he replied. Not just as a consultant, but as a full partner in developing new training methodologies. Elena considered the offer carefully. That would be a significant undertaking. It would require extensive collaboration and a willingness to challenge existing assumptions about how combat training should be conducted. After what I've seen today, General Thornfield said, I think challenging our assumptions is exactly what we need to do. As the day continued, Elena worked with small groups of soldiers, teaching them to understand and apply biomechanical principles to their training. The enthusiasm was infectious, with personnel who had initially been skeptical becoming some of the most eager students. The transformation in General Thornfield was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire day. From his initial dismissive attitude toward Elena's expertise, he had evolved into one of her most committed supporters. More importantly, he had recognized that true leadership required the humility to acknowledge when established methods could be improved. You know, he said to Elena during a quiet moment between training sessions, what happened today wasn't really about fighting techniques. Elena looked at him questioningly. What do you think it was about? It was about learning, he replied. Learning that expertise can come from unexpected sources, that assumptions need to be tested, and that real strength sometimes means admitting when you've been wrong. I think you're right, Elena agreed. And I learned that practical application is just as important as theoretical understanding. What we created here today was better than either of us could have achieved alone. As the training facility began to empty at the end of the day, General Thornfield and Elena found themselves alone on the mat where their confrontation had taken place hours earlier. The space that had witnessed conflict and challenge was now simply a training area where new knowledge had been created and shared. Miss Rodriguez, the general said formally, thank you for teaching me something important today. Thank you for being open to learning it, Elena replied. Not everyone in your position would have had the courage to acknowledge that their methods could be improved. General Thornfield smiled. Well, I've learned that courage sometimes means being willing to get knocked down by someone half your size. Elena laughed. And I've learned that the best teaching often happens when both the instructor and the student are willing to be surprised. As they walked toward the exit together, both knew that the day's events had changed more than just their understanding of combat techniques. They had created a new model for how military and civilian expertise could collaborate, how traditional knowledge could be enhanced by fresh perspectives, and how genuine learning could emerge from the most unexpected encounters. The story of General Thornfield being knocked out by a civilian consultant would spread throughout the military community, but not as a tale of embarrassment or failure. Instead, it became a powerful example of how intellectual humility and openness to new ideas could lead to breakthrough innovations in training and performance. Elena's biomechanical approaches were eventually adopted throughout multiple branches of the military, reducing training injuries while improving combat effectiveness. General Thornfield became one of the military's strongest advocates for interdisciplinary collaboration, frequently speaking about the importance of challenging assumptions and learning from diverse sources of expertise. The training facility where their confrontation had taken place became a center for innovative combat instruction, where traditional military techniques were enhanced by scientific understanding and where both military personnel and civilian experts worked together to push the boundaries of human performance. Years later, when asked about that memorable day, both Elena and General Thornfield would emphasize that the most important outcome wasn't who won or lost their brief physical encounter, but rather what they learned about the power of combining different types of knowledge and expertise. Their story became a model for how conflict could be transformed into collaboration and how genuine respect could emerge from honest challenge and mutual learning.